Welcome back to Essential Foundations course on analytic idealism. Last time, in part 5, we've reviewed the empirical evidence coming from laboratories around the world that seems to support analytic idealism and outright contradict mainstream physicalism. We've seen that in the field of neuroscience of consciousness, there is a very broad pattern of experimental results, even clinical results, showing that some types of impairment or reduction of ordinary brain activity correlate precisely with an unfathomable expansion of consciousness in terms of the richness of experience and the intensity of experience. Some people think that the intensity of experience doesn't count. It doesn't need to be underpinned by brain activity under the premises of mainstream physicalism. But of course it does. Intensity is a quality of experience. It has to come from some pattern of metabolism in the brain under mainstream physicalist assumptions. And we've seen that there is a broad set of phenomena in which this assumed correlation is not only not there, it is inverted. We've also seen that a series of ever more sophisticated and careful experiments in the field of foundations of physics, running from the late 70s until today, has shown that physical reality, physical objects, physical entities, or the observables, the properties of physical objects like mass, momentum, spin, these things do not exist at all prior to them being measured, which shows that physical properties, physicality, the physical world, does not have standalone existence. It was not there as a physical reality prior to measurement. Measurement doesn't only uncover physical properties that were already there. No, measurement somehow brings the properties of physicality into existence. And we've seen that that is entirely consistent with the dashboard metaphor. Measurement is what appears on the dials on the dashboard, which we call the screen of perception, whether it's aided by instrumentation or not. Therefore, the dials on the screen of perception only indicate something, anything, if a measurement is being performed, if the world outside, as it is in itself, is being somehow observed. Prior to observation, the world outside, as it is in itself, is still there. It has standalone reality, but it isn't physical because physicality is what the dials on the dashboard are pointing to, and they only point to something upon measurement. Prior to measurement, there is no sense in talking about the position of the dials. They haven't measured anything else. They will be pointing at zero. In other words, nothingness. There is nothing there. And we've also seen that the only alternative to this philosophical conclusion from physical experiments, namely the conclusion that physical reality is not fundamental, that physical entities do not have standalone existence, that instead they are just the image, the representation, the appearance of a deeper layer of reality, which itself then has standalone reality. The only alternative to this conclusion, based on the results of the experiments, is to postulate, rather arbitrarily, I think, that there is a countless gazillion, a practical infinity of new physical universes being created out of nothing, every infinitesimal fraction of a femtosecond, and for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence. You take your pick about which of these two alternatives is more reasonable, more plausible, and frankly, more level-headed and sane. Anyway, that was part 5. Now, in this part 6, we are going to explore a key question. I split this out from the other parts because I think this is important enough to deserve a part of its own, even though it will be a short part. And that's the idea of the unconscious. Because linguistically, if we say, well, the unconscious exists, and I think what psychologists call the unconscious definitely exists, people might think, well, if there is something unconscious, then there is something that is not phenomenally conscious. because it's unconscious. Therefore, analytic idealism cannot be right, because according to analytic idealism, there is only phenomenal consciousness. It is the single entity in the reduction base. It's the thing in terms of which we should be able to explain everything else. Therefore, the unconscious violates analytic idealism. Well, I will argue in this part that this is not at all the case, because, and here we go, we need first to know exactly what we mean by these words. Consciousness, unconsciousness, phenomenal, meta-consciousness, what we mean by this, because the seeming conflict arises from a linguistic confusion. That's the argument I will make in this part 6. What we call phenomenal consciousness in analytic philosophy, it has a formal definition, can be defined as such: a state in which there is something, anything, it is like to be. So you are phenomenally conscious if there is something, it is like to be you. If there is nothing it's like to be you, then you are not phenomenally conscious. You are phenomenally unconscious, like my telephone. I don't think there is anything it is like to be my telephone in and of itself. My telephone is thus phenomenally unconscious in and of itself. It may be in consciousness, it may be in universal consciousness, it may be part of the picture we call the inanimate universe, which under analytic idealism is phenomenally conscious as a whole, but the phone separate from the rest, the phone in and of itself, under analytic idealism, is not phenomenally conscious in and of itself. Only the inanimate universe as a whole is phenomenally conscious. All right, now there is another term that is technically called meta-consciousness. There's a number of alternatives. You could call it conscious metacognition. You could call it conscious self-reflection. You could call it conscious self-awareness or self-awareness. Meta-consciousness is a very unambiguous, descriptive, technical term, so I'll stick to it. And that is the explicit emphasis on the word explicit. It is the explicit awareness of a phenomenally conscious state. In other words, if you are having a pain, that means that there is something it is like to be you having the pain. So the pain is phenomenally conscious. But to be meta-conscious of the pain, it is not enough to simply feel the pain. You have to know that you feel the pain. And this knowing that you are conscious is the explicit awareness of that conscious event. You see, meta-consciousness requires something on top of, in addition to phenomenal consciousness. You need to be phenomenally conscious in order to be meta-conscious, but it's not enough to be phenomenally conscious. As a matter of fact, most of us at all times are most of us at all times are meta-conscious of only a small subset of our experiences. For instance, right now and 10 minutes ago, you were phenomenally conscious of your breathing. You could experience the airflow in and out of your nostrils. You could experience the dilation of your rib cage as your lungs inflated and deflated. You would experience the movement of your diaphragm as you breathed. You were phenomenally conscious of all those things 10 minutes ago, but you were not explicitly aware of those experiences. In other words, you were phenomenally conscious of them, but you were not meta-conscious of them. You were not saying to yourself, oh, I am breathing, I am feeling my breathing right now. You're doing this now because I'm calling your attention to it. I'm sort of suggesting that you place your attention on your breathing, and then you will become meta-conscious of your breathing. You will know that you are experiencing the dilation of your rib cage, the airflow in and out of your nostrils, and so on. But 10 minutes ago, you were not meta-conscious of it. You were not explicitly aware of it. But you were phenomenally conscious of it. Is it plausible to say that you were completely unconscious of your breathing 10 minutes ago? Nothing changed between then and now, except that now you're placing your attention on it. You're placing that experience within the focus of attention, which is what we call self-reflective introspection, or meta-consciousness, or explicit awareness. But everything about you that allows you to be phenomenally conscious of your breathing right now was in place 10 minutes ago. Nothing changed. All of your nerves were in place. Only your attention was somewhere else. Therefore, you were not meta-conscious of your breathing 10 minutes ago. There is literature, technical literature, linking meta-consciousness to attention. There's a Dutch paper that does exactly that and shows that experimentally that is the case. I'm going to link that paper and a bunch of others to the description of this video, but look out for that. It's a paper that shows that meta-consciousness goes hand in hand with attention. Right. The idea of meta-consciousness was, for the first time, most clearly articulated, I think, by Jonathan Schooler in this 2012 paper, August 2012, published on Trends in Cognitive Sciences. Of course, I will be linking it down here in the description of this video as well. And there he elaborates on what this is. Let me read a passage with you. Critical to both the centrality of the conscious-non-conscious distinction and its equation with reportability is the assumption that people are explicitly aware of their conscious experiences. However, this assumption is challenged when subjective experience is dissociated from the explicit awareness of that experience. Such dissociations demonstrate the importance of distinguishing between consciousness and meta-consciousness. So let's parse this. Let's first look at what he means by this word reportability. Reportability is when you can tell yourself and others that you are having a certain experience. Like if you're in pain and you go to your doctor and you say, "Doctor, I feel pain." You are reporting your conscious inner state to the doctor. We may even report it to ourselves. We may tell ourselves, "Darn, this pain is making me very uncomfortable right now." That's reportability. And reportability requires that you be meta-conscious of the experience you are reporting. Because if you have an experience, but you don't know that you have that experience, you can't report it. If you are in pain, but you're so distracted with other things that you're not meta-conscious of your pain, you can't report it to yourself or to your doctor. And men, more specifically, have this tendency to have pain and not be meta-conscious of it. Sometimes I catch myself realizing that I have been in pain for 2 days, but only at that moment, 2 days later, did I become explicitly aware of it? Did I gain metacognitive awareness of it? Did I get the knowledge that I was in pain? But retroactively, I knew that I was phenomenally conscious of the pain since a couple of days. Men, it happens a lot with men that we are not metacognitively aware of our own feelings and emotions sometimes. So reportability goes hand in hand with meta-consciousness. That you could even say they are synonyms. To be meta-conscious of something is to be able to report it to self and others. And then Schooler emphasizes that the assumption that subjective experience is always explicit, that we are always explicitly aware of subjective experience, is wrong, because sometimes the explicit awareness is dissociated from the subjective experience itself. In other words, sometimes we have the experience, but we don't know that we have the experience. We are not able to report the experience to ourselves or to others. And this is key to distinguishing between consciousness and meta-consciousness. Meta-consciousness is but a subset of phenomenal consciousness. It's the subset of the contents of phenomenal consciousness upon which the focus of our attention falls. And then that subset becomes reportable. Then we become explicitly aware of it and capable of reporting it to ourselves. Only then do we gain the knowledge that we are having those experiences in the subset. But we were already having those experiences phenomenally even before our attention fell on them. All right. And this is my own summary here. The conscious knowledge of the experience, which comes in addition to the experience itself, is what Schuller calls a re-representation. We have to internally re-represent, represent again a phenomenal state in order to become meta-conscious of it. Schuller talks about it in this next passage. Periodically, attention, there you go, attention, even Schuller associates meta-consciousness with attention. Periodically, attention is directed towards explicitly assessing the contents of experience. The resulting meta-consciousness involves an explicit re-representation of consciousness in which one interprets, describes, or otherwise characterizes the state of one's mind. In other words, when one reports the state of one's mind to self or others. So re-representation is what happens within the field of attention that allows us to become metacognitively aware of an experience, meta-conscious of the experience, self-aware of the experience, self-reflective of the experience. There are a number of words you can use to describe the same thing. So let's draw a diagram about this. There is a world out there. As we've seen, it's not physical. Physicality is just what appears on the screen of perception, which is an internal dashboard of dials. The world as itself is more akin, as it is in itself, is more akin to a thought. So that's why I put this little balloon to suggest there is a thought. But there is a world out there, as it is in itself, and we all inhabit that world. And then when we look at it, we form internal representations on the screen of perception, on the dashboard of dials. And we see a colorful chair, a colorful table, and an umbrella, a sunscreen, whatever you call it. These are our internal representations of the world as it is in itself. This is physicality. Physicality is these internal representations of the world as it is in itself. The world as it is in itself has no spatial-temporal extension. It's not made of objects. It's not physical. It doesn't have mass, doesn't have spin, momentum, electric charge, amplitude, frequency. These are all ways for us to describe the contents of perception, the representations, not the world as it is in itself, which is more akin to an endogenous inner thought, an inner experience, transpersonal one. Now, for you to become meta-conscious of what you are seeing, you need more than these representations. You need re-representations. So let's say the representations are on your visual cortex, and the re-representations may be, say, in your prefrontal cortex. And they are related to one another. There is a sort of a back and forth between them, because by re-representing your experience, you bring your attention even more to the original experience. When you say, I am in pain, you bring more attention to the original pain and you feel it more, which makes you re-represent it again because it sort of draws your attention again since it's uncomfortable. So you have this back and forth in your awareness between the original phenomenal experience and its internal re-representation, and they sort of reinforce each other in a closed loop. We have many words to express when this happens and it's negative. So people who tend to be too much in themselves, you know, ruminating, thinking things over again and again. So you have this closed loop between an internal representation, which may be something about the external world, like you saw something that made you unhappy, and its internal re-representation, and which leads to all the thinking about what does that mean, and you get into a loop that involves more than just the representations and the re-representations. It may involve other thoughts and emotions, but it certainly involves these two things in a closed loop. As a matter of fact, we know from the neuroscience of consciousness that the so-called neural correlates of consciousness seem to be always associated with a back and forth of information transfer between two different brain areas. Now, I submit to you that what we call the neural correlates of consciousness are, in fact, the neural correlates of meta-consciousness. Why? Because the study of consciousness is fundamentally dependent or has been fully dependent until very recently on the reporting of the subject. People have to report to you what they are conscious of for you to know what they are conscious of. Only very recently, a new paradigm has emerged in neuroscience called the no-report paradigm, but it's still in its infancy. For the longest of times, the study of consciousness has been fundamentally dependent on reporting, and it is still largely dependent on reporting. Now, as we've discussed just now, for a subject to be able to report an experience, the subject has not only to have the experience, the subject has to know that he or she has the experience. In other words, we need more than the representation. We need the re-representation. So, since consciousness is related to brain activity based on the reporting of the subject, the neurocorrelates of consciousness are, by construction, because of how the studies are constructed, the neurocorrelates of meta-consciousness, because they're based on what the subjects report. And what they report is the content of meta-consciousness, not the broader, more scattered and varied contents of phenomenal consciousness alone. So, therefore, all the studies of the neurocorrelates of consciousness until very recently were in fact talking about the correlates of meta-consciousness. And if you look at what they are, they look across these 4 papers, for instance. There are many more. I'm linking everything below. Don't worry about it. I'm just showing you some examples. All these papers show that for there to be meta-consciousness, for the subject to be able to report an inner experience, there has to be a back and forth of information transfer between 2 brain areas, which suggests that this is what's happening. This is the back and forth between the representation, the internal representation here, and the re-representations of metacognitive awareness. Phenomenal consciousness itself entails only this. It doesn't require this. So the field of phenomenality is broader, larger, than the field of metacognitive re-representations. Phenomenal consciousness is much broader than metaconsciousness. Now, why is this important? Because when we talk about an unconscious, we are talking about lack of metaconsciousnness, not lack of phenomenal consciousness. If I cannot report an experience, a neuroscientist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, they would think, okay, that's then unconscious. Well, in fact, it may very well be phenomenally conscious, but not reportable because there is a lack of re-representation, because there is no metacognitive awareness, there is no meta-consciousness. The experience in question doesn't fall within the field of attention, but it is still within the field of phenomenal consciousness. And the problem is that a lot of neuroscientists explicitly conflate phenomenal consciousness with meta-consciousness. Look, for instance, at this paper by Alex Clearmans. I quote here the extract that is relevant. He says, awareness, on the other hand, always seems to minimally entail the ability of knowing that one knows. What is this knowing that one knows? He even italicized the that. This is a re-representation. This is meta-consciousness he's talking about. He is equating awareness to meta-consciousness, not to phenomenal consciousness. This ability, after all, forms the basis for the verbal reports we take to be the most direct indication of awareness. No, these are indications of metacognitive awareness, not awareness pure and simple. These are indicators of metaconsciousness, not phenomenal consciousness as philosophers define the word. When we observe the absence of such ability to report on the knowledge involved in our decisions, we rightfully conclude that decision was based on unconscious knowledge. Unconscious knowledge. No, this is wrong. It may very well have been based on phenomenally conscious knowledge, but knowledge that was not metaconscious and therefore could not be reported. You see? Thus, it is when an agent exhibits knowledge of the fact that he is sensitive to some state of affairs that we take this agent to be a conscious agent. No, 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 no. The knowledge he's talking about here is what's entailed by metacognition, consciousness. The agent can very well be phenomenally conscious without this knowledge. This second-order knowledge, he's appealing to re-representation, representing a second time. That's the second-order knowledge he's talking about. I argue, critically depends on learned systems of meta-representations. Yeah, I agree with you on that. It depends on meta-representations. In other words, re-representations. And forms the basis for conscious experience. No, it forms the basis of meta-conscious experience, not phenomenally conscious experience. Do you see the problem? That's why we get all confused with these words. And, you know, I'm singling out Alex Clearmans here because he has been the most overt and explicit about it, but it's unfair to him to give the impression that he is the only one, because this conflation has been going on since the early days of depth psychology in the late 19th century. If you look at the works of Freud and Jung, particularly Jung, I consider myself, a mild expert in Jung's work. Jung explicitly defines what he called consciousness as experience requiring three other conditions. The experience has to be, as he says, and I will quote now, under the control of a will, which is his word for the experience has to be deliberate. It also has to be inserted in a web of cognitive associations. It has to have a semantic context. So, for instance, if you're experiencing mother, then you associate mother with milk, mother with birth, mother with life, mother with protection and safety, mother with father, mother with home. So this is all the semantic web of cognitive associations that goes around what Jung calls a conscious experience, a conscious content of the psyche. And number three, he also says that we have to be metacognitively aware of the experience for it to be conscious. He doesn't use these words, metacognitive awareness or metaconsciousness. These are relatively recent words in the psychiatric jargon. But if you look at how he describes what is required for consciousness, you realize that that's what he was talking about. So when Jung talked of consciousness, he was talking of metaconsciousness. Therefore, when he referred to the unconscious, he was referring to what is not metaconscious, not to what is not phenomenally conscious. You see, for Jung, the unconscious was part of the psyche, the word he used. And the psyche was experiential. So by saying that the unconscious was part of the psyche, he was saying that the unconscious was experiential in nature. So why did he call it the unconscious? Because it was not metaconscious. You see, it was not deliberate. It didn't form part of a web of semantic associations. And these are experiences that people do not know that they have the experiences. And therefore, they don't report those experiences to the therapist. That's the sense in which he used the word unconscious. Arguably, Freud did the same, but for different reasons, I would argue. For Freud, unlike Jung, the unconscious was made of former contents of consciousness, contents that have been repressed or denied. But they were psychic in the sense that they still had the same nature they had when they were born, and they were born in consciousness. So by becoming unconscious, they didn't turn into something completely else. And that's the basis in which I would say for Freud too, the personal unconscious was made of phenomenal experiences that we have continuously, but which we cannot report even to ourselves because we deny and repress those experiences. So it's like a repressed pain. If you are well trained enough in ignoring pain, like professional soldiers or professional fighters are, you are able to eliminate metacognitive awareness of your pain. In other words, you eliminate meta-consciousness of your pain. But boy, do you still feel it. It's still there. And you can prove it yourself by then bringing your attention back to the pain and then realizing retrospectively on the mirror of memory that you were in pain all along. So this conflation between consciousness and meta-consciousness has been around since the early days of depth psychology, and we shouldn't single out Clearmans as the sole guilty party about it. It's widespread even in today's analytic philosophy. There is a surprising and I would say unacceptable lack of sophistication scholars have about the subtleties of these differences. These differences are real. They exist. We miss them at our own cost, at our own loss, so to say. It is very important for philosophers of mind to have minimum introspective awareness of what mind is from a first-person perspective before they can start lucidly writing about mind. And unfortunately, that doesn't often happen. A lot of, well, at least some philosophers of mind I am aware of are incredibly unsophisticated as far as introspection goes. They do not know much about the subject of their study from a first-person perspective, which is the only perspective you can really study the mind with depth. Everything else becomes a scholarly, puzzle-solving exercise based on what others have read, but others have written. But none of what is written has any weight unless it has originally come from an introspective awareness of what mind and experience are, right? So it is important to keep this distinction in mind. And if you do so, then you realize that the distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness is not the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and the lack of phenomenal consciousness. No. There is only phenomenal consciousness under analytic idealism. And what we call the unconscious under analytic idealism is merely the parts of phenomenal consciousness, the contents, the excitation patterns of phenomenal consciousness that are not meta-conscious, or which are dissociated from the perspective of a certain center of awareness. But we've talked about dissociation in part 4 already. I'm not going to repeat that. We can account for the unconscious based on two things. What I've talked about today, which is the unconscious, with air quotes, it represents the lack of meta-consciousness, not the lack of phenomenal consciousness. That's number one. Number two, what we call the unconscious are the contents of universal phenomenal consciousness from which we are dissociated. So dissociation and meta-consciousness or re-representation account for what we call the unconscious within the framework of analytic idealism without contradicting analytic idealism. Now you might say, well, but okay, even if we can grant this separation between consciousness and meta-consciousness, we know that sometimes we go flat out unconscious. Like if I pass out, I am unconscious. If I am under general anesthesia, I am unconscious. If I am sleeping and not dreaming, I am unconscious. I am unconscious all the time, every day. Is that true? No, that's not necessarily true. Because when we say wake up in the morning and we don't remember our dreams and we say, okay, I have been unconscious for the past 6 or 7 hours. Actually, all you can say for sure is that you do not recall experiencing anything for the past 6 or 7 hours. You cannot categorically say, based on the empirical data of the moment, that you were not conscious during those 6 or 7 hours. The best you can say is that you do not recall being conscious. And that may have two explanations. If you don't recall being conscious, either you're really not conscious or you just don't remember consciousness that you actually had during 6 or 7 hours. And we know that that happens. How many times did it happen to me that I wake up in the morning in a hurry to go to work, and I don't remember having had any dream. I thought I was flat out in the dark the entire night. And then only for later in the day or in the evening, because of some cognitive association I make with what somebody said or something I saw on TV, then I remember I had a dream, a very intense, very rich dream the previous night. So how can I be ever sure that I was not conscious during sleep? As a matter of fact, you know, even if you're not dreaming, and we can know that, and I'm alluding to this paper now, we know that because if you are asleep, we can hook you up to an EEG cap, and dream activity has a certain neurocorrelate that we can see on the EEG traces. So we know when a person is dreaming or not. So these guys here, Jennifer Vint, she has a bunch of very nice papers, by the way. I like her work a lot. They had this brilliant idea of taking a bunch of volunteers, putting an EEG cap on them and measuring their brain activity through the night as they slept. And then when they knew from the EEG that the subject was not dreaming, they knew that for sure, they would wake up the subject and ask, were you conscious? Were you thinking about something? Were you having any experience? And invariably, the subject would say, yes, yes, I was experiencing something, even though the subject was not dreaming. Because you see, dreaming is a very particular type of experience. It's a type of immersive visionary experience. If you're imagining things awake, you have imagery in your mind, but it's not immersive. You're not surrounded by that imagery. It's like you're projecting it in front of you. Dreams are immersive. The visuals surround you. And it turns out that subjects who were not dreaming when they were awoke were having non-immersive experiences. And in this paper, they show at least 3 types of sleep experiences that are not dreams. One is sleep thinking. It turns out we actually think while we are asleep, and that thinking is not immersive. Another one was selfless experiential states. Experiential states in which there doesn't seem to be an individual self involved. Notice that if you're thinking, that presupposes and entails an individual self that is doing the thinking. But there are these selfless states of awareness in which, of course, there is a perceiver, but that perceiver is not an individual self. It's more like the Buddhist meditative state of selflessness. And there was also a type of subliminal perception during sleep, non-immersive as well, but people would have non-metacognitive perceptual experiences during sleep, outside of dreaming. By the way, that's an important point. This same researcher here, Jennifer Vint, I think the paper I'm going to allude to right now was written by her in 2007, I think, if I remember it correctly. But she also verified that during dreams, we are largely not meta-conscious. That dreams involve phenomenal states, but not re-representations of those states. In other words, during the dream, we are experiencing, but we don't know that we are experiencing. There is a paper by her, which I will link underneath, or maybe it's by someone else, I don't remember quite well. But there is a paper from 2007, I think, that has studied this and has shown that dreams largely lack metaconsciousness, self-reflective awareness, which shows very clearly that you can have experience without metaconsciousness, because, you know, we dream, we all know we dream. And then you might say, well, but if we lack metaconsciousness, and we don't know that we were having the experiences that we call the dream, how can we say that we dreamed? How do we know that we dreamed? We must be meta-conscious of dreams. That's the thing. We are only meta-conscious of the dream after we wake up and we review the dream on the mirror of memory. So we are meta-conscious of remembering the dream. But during the dream, we are largely not meta-conscious, even though we certainly are phenomenally conscious. So you see, this is the types of experience that we can have are very rich, very varied, very subtle, and very nuanced too. And it's important, especially in the Western tradition, that we develop some sophistication about this, because otherwise things will just pass us by. We will not see what's going on. It's bad enough that our vocabulary about states of mind is so limited compared to what people in the East have, for instance. We are not very sophisticated about it because we don't have a tradition of introspection in the West, like people in the subcontinent have, and in a broader sense, people in the East have. But we desperately need to evolve this vocabulary, to evolve the subtlety of introspective awareness, in order to be able to know what we are talking about. We are talking about mind and experience here. We ought to have some kind of sophistication in our understanding of what mind and experience are, so we can talk with some reason about it. Otherwise, we are playing an artificial conceptual game, a sort of checkers game on a board that has nothing to do with the reality it supposedly represents. So, but to go on the theme of this slide, I mean, there is research showing that even during general anesthesia, there are subliminal perceptions, or there are forms of awareness during general anesthesia, during surgery, which doesn't mean that you're feeling the pain of the surgery. That's not what I'm implying here. It means that you're having some form of experience during general anesthesia, which you can then not remember afterwards. Because we know, and that's, I don't even need to point a paper because this is textbook now, it's common knowledge, anesthesia impairs memory formation. There are drugs used by anesthesiologists that aim at exactly doing that, not allowing you to remember. So when we wake up from general anesthesia, we say, oh, I was not conscious. Well, you don't remember that you were conscious because the drugs had that effect. They were meant, some of the drugs were meant to have that effect. And even the ones that were not meant to have that effect also have that effect. We also know that if we don't have metacognition of an experience, if we are not metaconscious of an experience, it's harder to remember it later. Because memory pathways are facilitated by our knowing that we had the experience. And by our telling ourselves, I am having this experience right now. And then you remember it later. But if you don't tell yourself, I am having that experience right now, it's very hard to remember the experience later. So we have to get more sophisticated. You know, unconsciousness, literally defined as the lack of phenomenal consciousness, is never there. You are never really phenomenally unconscious. You just have different states of consciousness. Some metaconscious, some not. Some dissociated, some not. Some intense, some less intense. Some that you remember, and some that you don't remember. You see? This is what we're talking about. So, none of this stuff surrounding the very confusing concept of unconsciousness in Western thinking today, none of it contradicts idealism, analytic idealism. On the contrary, they tend to reinforce analytic idealism because there is a lot of research coming out now. One of the examples is this paper. I will be linking others underneath. You can have a look. There is a variety of other cases. A lot of this new research is showing that all of these states that we associate with seeming unconsciousness, such as syncope, you know, when you pass out, or sleep, dreamless sleep, or general anesthesia, or hyperventilation, you pass out by breathing too deep and too fast. All these states that we traditionally associate with unconsciousness, they are actually conscious. Neuroscience of consciousness is now showing that there is phenomenal consciousness entailed in all of these states. So this actually reinforces analytic idealism insofar as the key premise of analytic idealism is that all there is phenomenal consciousness. Now, there are many modalities of experience within phenomenal consciousness. Some of them fall within attention and are metacognitive, others don't. Some are dissociated in different alters, in different centers of awareness. Some are remembered, some not, but they are all phenomenally conscious. There is a broad spectrum of types and qualities, but they are all ultimately phenomenally conscious. All right, so let's try to extract some conclusions from this whole course now in this one slide. Very briefly, we've seen that, and now it's first point here, we've seen that this theoretical abstraction called matter outside consciousness is an unnecessary explanatory entity to make sense of reality. It creates more problems than it solves. It doesn't account for experience, which is the hard problem of consciousness. Therefore, creating this problem, it entails the need to reduce experience, which is impossible to do. So there is a problem right there that is created by this entity. And then it also fails to account for a number of things, like states of consciousness that are that involve richer and intenser experience compared to a placebo baseline, while brain activity has significantly been reduced or impaired at the same time. Or it fails to account for experiments from foundations of physics that show that physicality has no standalone existence. So it doesn't solve the problem. It is conceptually unparsimonious because it puts forward a non-tick category that we don't need at all to make sense of things, and it only creates problems instead of explaining anything. We can account for everything, all empirical phenomena, including the introspective ones, on the basis of a spatially unbound field of phenomenal consciousness, a spatially unbound field of subjectivity, a universal subject, if you will, because as we've seen, experience is just a pattern of excitation of the experiencer. The experiencer is the ultimate element in the reduction base. We can explain everything on the basis of one universal phenomenal consciousness alone. What we need to do is to take into account and keep in mind that the so-called unconscious is merely a segment of this phenomenal consciousness that lacks, for instance, a self-reflective awareness, that lacks re-representation, that's not accessible through self-reflection. Or it may be a content of phenomenal consciousness that is dissociated from the perspective of a certain center of awareness within that field of subjectivity. We've discussed this in part 4. We also have to keep in mind that we need to make sense of the empirical fact that there seems to be multiple minds. So if ultimately there is only one universal mind, how do we account for the seeming multiple mentalities that exist? I mean, I can't read your thoughts, presumably you can't read mine, so we seem to have different minds. Well, we only need a process called dissociation to make sense of that. And dissociation is an empirical fact. We know that dissociation exists in nature. We know that it is strong enough for the purposes of this metaphysics. And we know that it does exactly what it needs to do for us to be able to use it as an explanatory process to solve the so-called decomposition problem, to explain how multiple minds actually exist within one single unified mind. And the empirical evidence is remarkably consistent with this hypothesis, as we've seen. There are two main lines of evidence that we've looked at. One is the refutation of physical realism in Foundations of Physics, the refutation of this notion that the physical world has standalone existence, that it's primary. Foundations of Physics is showing us that unless you believe in a fairy tale of infinite universes are popping out of nowhere at every infinitesimal fraction of a second for which there is no empirical evidence at all, zero empirical evidence, unless you believe in this fairy tale, then you have to acknowledge that science is telling us physicality, the things characterized by the properties we call observables, like mass, charge, spin, momentum. What gives the physical world its physicality, these things do not exist prior to a measurement, prior to being observed. Whatever is out there prior to measurement is not physical. Physicality is the result of measurement. It's the position of the dials on our internal dashboard, which is measuring the world outside. But we don't have a transparent windscreen, a transparent window to see the world outside as it is in itself. We only have the dashboard, and the dashboard is physicality. And it's always measuring whatever is really out there. And the result of that measurement is what we call the physical world, but it's not the ultimate reality. And there is another line of empirical evidence, as we've seen in the psychiatry and neuroscience of consciousness, which seem to contradict physicalist tenets. So much so that there is a sort of a desperate search for a way to save a mainstream physicalism from the clutches of these results, which is leading to some ludicrous arguments being put forward with a straight face in some major scientific publications. We've seen that in part 5, I believe, about empirical evidence. So this is it. There will be one more part to this course, part 7, in which I will address some of the more significant criticisms of analytic idealism, and I will answer them one by one. It will be a short, straightforward part, because now we've covered most of the content of that part as well. So I will do that just sort of to link content you have already seen to specific criticisms, so we know, where the correspondences are, and such that I explicitly address the criticisms, not only implicitly as I have already done from part 1 to part 6. All right, take care, and I will see you next time.